Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be across the globe. Welcome to another live webinar here on iThemes Training. It is WordPress Disaster Week, sponsored by iThemes Security Pro. My name is Nathan Ingram. I'm the host here at iThemes Training, and this week we are hearing from our group of experts on WordPress security. Yesterday we talked about how hacks happen and how to respond. A couple of great talks from Kathy Zant about the big picture of website security. By the way, if you missed any part of yesterday and you'd like to go back and rewatch those videos or share them with someone else, you may do so using the Watch Replay Videos link down below the chat room, and those videos are ready to go. We'll have today's replays up about an hour-ish after we wrap up today, as soon as we can get those uploaded and rendered, so you'll be able to rewatch today as well. So yesterday, a couple of great talks from Kathy Zant about the big picture of website security. Tomorrow, I'll be sharing on how to provide security services to your clients in a WordPress care plan that's powered by iThemes products. But today, we'll be hearing from Michael Moore and Timothy Jacobs in two talks that are focused specifically on using iThemes Security Pro to protect your website. So we're going to get started today with Michael Moore. Michael has been presenting security-related topics for years here on iThemes Training. He began working with iThemes as a support technician focused on iThemes security. He's answered thousands of questions helping people secure their WordPress sites over the years. And today, Michael's the iThemes product manager, and he's focused on continually improving iThemes Security Pro and other iThemes products for our customers. Hey, Michael, how's it going? What's happening in your world today?
Well, I am just excited to be here. Excited to talk about the logs and continue off of Kathy's great presentations from yesterday. So yeah, it's been a good disaster week so far. Hoping to continue it on today.
Absolutely. So today, Michael, you're talking about 7 ways you can detect and stop malicious behavior. We're going to do slides and some live demo, right?
That is correct. Yeah, we're going to talk about logging, and it's a underpraised but extremely important part of security. Go ahead.
No, absolutely. Kathy mentioned that a bit yesterday, and so we're going to get into the practical aspects of logging. Just a couple of brief notes before Michael digs in today. If you are just joining us in GoToWebinar, we want to invite you over to our chat room, which is located at ithemes.com/chat, ithemes.com/chat. That is the place to ask your questions as we go today. It's always helpful, especially in a large webinar like this one. If you have a question, to put the word question in all uppercase at the beginning, that just makes sure it catches my attention. And please, if you ask a question, just watch the chat room for the next minute or two in case I need to ask you a follow-up question so we can have good, clear questions for Michael to answer as he wraps up today. A couple of additional things to mention. We do have a live transcript happening of this event as I speak. So there is a blue button below the chat room where you can watch the live transcript, and it's ready to go and working. If for some reason you happen to see yesterday's transcript when you click that link, just refresh the page so you get the new link for today, for this hour of the webinar. It's a separate link for each hour so we can keep those transcripts separate. Also, the replays, as I mentioned earlier, the replays from yesterday are available. And there's a couple of great deals over in the sidebar beside the chat room. 35% off of iThemes Security Pro, as well as other iThemes products with the code Disaster35. Or if you want all the plugins, you can get those in the plugin suite at a special deal and 40% off. And all those deals are good through March 11th. That's Friday at 11:59 p.m. So if a couple of great deals if you don't have licensing for iThemes products yet and you'd like to. All right, so with that, Michael, let's get started. I'm looking forward to this.
All right. Well, before we hop in, just give a little outline of what we are covering today. We're going to talk about why logging is so critical to your website security, why malware scans are not enough to detect a breach, how hackers can remain undetected after a breach, and then to utilize or to show the importance of it, we're going to take a look at the SolarWinds hack that was disclosed in December of 2020, because it's going to give us a good example of the lengths that a hacker will go to stay undetected, and then also the importance that logging and monitoring played in finally detecting what was going on. And then we're going to talk about how to log a security event in iThemes Security Pro. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop right in. Well, so logging is going to be the first step to securing your website. And the reason why that is that you can't stop attacks that you don't know about. It is crazy when I was working in iThemes security support, how many times someone would get iThemes Security Pro and they would come in to support hot, angry, mad, telling us that iThemes Security Pro wasn't working. Well, what do you mean by it's not working? Well, all of a sudden I saw iThemes Security Pro and my site is getting attacked like crazy. No, that's actually not what was happening. Actually, that's iThemes Security Pro doing its job. And it's actually now that you have a tool put into place to monitor for things like brute force attacks, it not only is tracking it, it is actually stopping it. So you can't stop attacks that you don't know anything about. And without the right logging and monitoring in place, you're not going to be able to do that. It's also going to help you spot activity that can alert you to a breach. We're going to talk about how FireEye, a great security company, how they were alerted to something that blew the whistle on the whole Sunburst attack. And then we're also going to want to use our logs to assess the damage caused after attack. And then it's going to be able to aid in the repair of a hacked website. So if you're monitoring where people are going, or if you're able to identify the point of entry, you're going to be able to get that stuff patched. And then again, all of that you're not going to be able to do without logging. And what else to think about when you're thinking about logging is that most breach studies show that the average time to detect a breach is over 200 days. And the amount of time that gives an attacker or someone to modify, steal, or destroy your data, 200 days gives them a lot of time to do that and wreak a lot of havoc on your website. And so if those reasons aren't enough for you, the OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, they have a top 10 list of web application security risks, and logging is on the top 10, just because it's just so important to make sure that you have that, to have this record of things going on your site. So let's talk a little bit about why malware scans aren't enough. No malware scanner can identify every single piece of malware that exists. So let's talk a little bit about malware signatures versus behavior analysis. So what malware scanners do, they're great at identifying malware on your site that they know about. So it's a good thing to run on your website, but it's also keep in mind that it's limited to the database of malware. So malware signature is a series of bytes that are used to identify known pieces of malware. Signature-based malware scanning is fast, simple, and again, will detect 100% well-known pieces of malware on your website, and it's great for low-level hackers. But one thing to keep in mind is that there are so many new pieces of malware being generated every single day, and that there's no way for anyone to actually keep up with that, with all the different malware signatures, adding them to their database. And so we're seeing that people are becoming less reliant on those because again, there's just so many pieces of malware being added a day, it's impossible for it to detect everything. That's why behavioral analysis is becoming a little bit more important and a little bit more relied upon. So what behavioral analysis does, it checks software's actions to determine whether or not it's malicious. There's a ton of different types of behavior that can be deemed suspicious or malicious. For example, iThemes Security Pro leverages the Google Safe Browsing API, and the Google Safe Browsing API is a piece. It will check to see if you have any, if you're redirecting any site to any of your website's traffic to a known malicious site, and I'll go ahead and flag that, and then alert both the site owner and people going to that website to maybe not go in there, go into the website. All right, and then let me think. There is no foolproof method of detecting anything, as we'll see in just a little bit, but a combination of both behavioral and malware checks will significantly increase your chance of being alerted to evidence of a security breach. And now let's talk a little bit how hackers remain undetected. So these are going to be your higher level hackers that are actually will go to great lengths to avoid your different security levels that you have in place and to make sure that they aren't detected. So let's talk about the SolarWinds hack. So it's a huge hack that you probably saw being covered in the news in December of 2020, and then the first few months of 2021, it was everywhere. So SolarWinds is an American company that develops software for businesses to help manage their network systems and information technology infrastructure. And so the type of attack this was a supply chain attack. A supply chain attack, also called a value chain or third-party attack, occurs when someone infiltrates your system through an outside partner or provider with access to your systems and data. So in this instance, a bunch of people use SolarWinds to deploy different software, and then since they are since they're the third-party vendor working with big people like I have a list right here. Big people like Microsoft, a bunch of like just about every single government entity that you can possibly think of, and then so they supplied them. So all they had to do was get SolarWinds, and then down the supply chain, they were able to infect all these different Fortune 500 sites, U.S. telecommunications companies, and so on. And so the Sunburst supply chain attack was designed in a very professional way with a clear focus on staying undetected as long as possible. In fact, the evidence of, it wasn't disclosed until December, but the first evidence of when they actually were able to breach SolarWinds went all the way back to September 2019. So between the time that the point of entry to when it was disclosed, we're talking about over a year's time. So that exceeds that 200-day average that it takes to detect a breach. And so here's an abridged Sunburst workflow from summary. So it's provided by Shift Left. Excuse me. So we're not going to go through all this. There are some links in on the slide at the end that's going to some reference links that you can look to actually see if you want to take a deeper look at the play-by-play. One of them is this article by Mandiant, who this week was announced they actually got acquired by Google for what that's worth. So we're just going to hit a couple of these different things to kind of give you an idea of the lengths that these people went through to stay undetected. So, and this is going to illustrate why having layers of security and logging is going to be so important to make sure that you're detecting a breach. So one of the first things that they did is they, after they got into the SolarWinds workflow or into their SolarWinds server, is they had this DLL file that they were using to compromise. So after laterally moving to SolarWinds, they then also they studied the coding style of these different companies. So if it was, whether it was good or bad, they went to emulate it. So if there was something looking for checking different files for different coding standards they have, it could avoid that, or even a manual inspection. Okay, this looks like the either great code that this company writes, or it looks we're emulating the crappy code. So that gives, by maintaining the coding style, it gives an illusion of code legitimacy to conform to that of SolarWinds and the other people involved. And so the other thing it did was it lay dormant for 12 to 14 days. So after the initial dormant period, which again is up to 2 weeks, it would retrieve and execute different commands called jobs that include the ability to transfer files, execute files, profile the system, reboot the machine, and disable system services. And that's according to a FireEye analyst. The malware masqueraded network traffic as the Orion improvement program, protocol, and stores reconnaissance results, blah, 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 blah. All that means is they were running different tests, and they were looking at different things while making it look like they were part of the internal systems running. So they're using a DLL file that was a legitimate DLL file. In that DLL file, they added their a malicious payload to it. Then they stayed dormant before executing anything, just to not raise any immediate flags. And then they started looking to running different checks under the guise of the Orion Improvement Program, which is a thing that actually runs on the supposed to be running on the SolarWinds server. And then they checked to see if checked if a host attached to a domain or whether or not the domain was on a block list. So what they were doing here is they had this backdoor. It was they were looking to determine whether or not the system was joined to an Active Directory domain and retrieve the domain name. And then they had the they would cease execution if the system was on a block list. So if they were they had these hard-coded URLs they had that were SolarWinds domains that they were trying to avoid. So if they happened to be on one of those directories, they would go ahead and stop it because it would decrease the likelihood of them being detected if they didn't go ahead and execute that. And so then they would verify the different security tools and processes running on the host. And so they would check to see, is this something that we need to worry about? Is this something that we can get away with? If it's not, is there anything that we can do to disable this software? And then they're going to verify to see if they can, they would do a REST API command that was sent back to, that was under the guise of this API SolarWinds that they had modified. So again, at first glance, it looks like everything's okay, but they would generate a domain and then they would send a call back to their server, which they did. They had got a bunch of different servers in New Jersey. So by all estimations, this was a Russian state attack. So this was a sanctioned hack from the Russian government. And so what they would do is they, instead of having them do the have a bunch of IPs ping in the server from Russia, they got a bunch of AWS servers in New Jersey. That way it seemed like a local attack. And that also meant under local federal law, the NSA can actually like sniff into those servers because it's on US territory and it's not overseas. So again, they went so instead of having Russian IPs, they rented our servers to then attack here to stay undetected. And then again, if you're interested in this, there's a couple articles and references, a couple good YouTube videos out there that actually go really deep into this and play by play. But what we're just looking at is how they had all these different systems set in place, but a very determined nation state were able to get past this. And so finally, after months and months and months of them being inside, so someone who was a SolarWinds customer was FireEye, and they were the first people to actually spot the hack. It wasn't NSA, it wasn't Microsoft, it wasn't SolarWinds, it was actually FireEye. And FireEye is an American cybersecurity company, and they discovered the hack because they were alerted to a new 2FA device being added to an employee's account. So what does that mean is that they were monitoring and logging anytime someone added a new 2FA device. And so they saw that, and this was the thing that finally got them to start investigating what was actually happening. This little thing right here, this little alert for a 2FA device being added, caught their eye. And then because they had a long history of logs monitoring the different events they're having on the server, they're able to go and look at, go further down the chain to figure out when it was penetrated and who all it affected, and kind of find out it affected everyone. And so all of this is just kind of to show, like, there's no foolproof plan that you can do to stop everything. It's important to have multiple security layers. That's why I know Kathy was talking about it yesterday, going to harp on it again today. There's no one trick to stop every attack or protect yourself from every attack. It's important to have multiple security levels. So again, I want to real quick. So I know, so an iThemes Security Pro, let's just go and look at that real quick. There is a way to, let me just change screens real quick, and then we'll just bring this side up real quick. So there is a way to, in the settings, and the configure global, and then on logs, there's a way to set days to keep the database logs. The more you can keep it, the better. Now, if any of you are using the WordPress.org plugin that is designed to delete the database logs, I'd get rid of it. One, you don't need it because you can set a timeline of when you want your logs to be deleted without having to manually do them. It's 2022. Why are you manually deleting your logs? And beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, the initial SolarWinds hack, they initially gained access to the system in 2019, and they had all these different things that they are these different security. They're running all these different security events, and yet they still didn't catch it, because as we looked at the lengths of that people will go through to stay dormant, and then not just glancing through it once and not noticing anything crazy isn't good enough. To just look at it and then dismiss it, you're going to want those histories of events, because if something comes down farther down the line and that you're able to catch something, you're going to want that history of logs to again help you not only spot the activity, assess the damage, and maybe even find point of entry, and assess damage, find point of entry, and then repair. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how you can use iThemes Security Pro to monitor specific security events, to detect attacks and stop them from when they happen. So the first thing we're going to talk about is invalid login attempts. So the brute force is just going to be your most common type of attack. One, everyone knows where the WordPress login is, which isn't a bad thing. That's a ease of use kind of thing, just like everyone knows where your front door is. But since everyone knows where it is, there's so many people WordPress uses 40% of the web, so it's just an easy thing to do. And then brute force attacks require no skill. You can literally go to there's a ton of different places where you can go. Whoops, I didn't mean to link to that. That you can actually just get no coding required. You can get tools with graphical unit interfaces that you just send them out there. So no code required. You don't need to have any development skills. There's open source. Sorry, I thought I had this link of. So here's a top 10 list of most popular hacking tools that you can get that are going to make it easy for anyone to just go into this, tell you what I want to do, and it's going to go out and automate your brute force attack. And since WordPress is so popular, a lot of them are geared towards just WordPress. And so that's why it's important for you to monitor invalid login attempts, because that's the sure sign of a brute force attack. Just like the example I was told about earlier, how we had people come into support saying now they're getting hacked. No, now you're actually seeing the invalid login attempts happening on your website. And then, so monitoring for that is going to be able to allow you to detect a brute force attack and then also put a stop to it. So if you don't know what's going on, you're not going to be able to stop it. The other thing is user devices, is to track people's user devices. So in iThemes Security Pro, we have the trusted devices feature, which is trusted devices feature. So what that does is if someone logs into your site under a user, but is using a new device, iThemes Security Pro will restrict their capabilities until they're able to confirm the device is them. So let me show you an example of that here. So this is just a site that I have up that we can see in my user profile page. It has a list of my approved devices. And so we can see right here, I had these IP addresses come to log into this site as me, but I was able to deny them, which restricted their capabilities and then blocked their access to the site, which then also will require me to change update my passwords, because if they're logging in, that means they already have access to your password. But this is something like the FireEye two-factor authentication thing, where they had a new 2FA device was added, and that alerted them to the whole SolarWinds hack. And that's what alerted to them that there was a breach that happened. So monitoring the devices, especially for your admin users, can come in handy, because if there's a new device being logged in, one, you can deny it, which will immediately log them out, and then also give you an opportunity to update your password to increase your security. And then that might be the triggering event that you want to use to go and look back throughout your logs to see if anything else happened. Another thing that you'll want to monitor for is bot activity. So there's good bots and bad bots. All a bot is a piece of software programs to perform a specific task. Bots so there's good bots that will help us perform repetitive and mundane tasks way faster than we can and save us from doing awful, tedious work. So there's also various different kinds of bad bots crawling your website. Some of the bots, have nefarious motives, like trying to break into your website, scrape your data, trying to, the different list of sites that we showed or different things that we have here. These are just brute force enabled bots. Some of them have like the dictionary attacks where they have a list of the username and passwords from database breaches. I know I saw earlier someone mentioned in the chat they have been pwned. iThemes security utilizes that so you can prevent people from using compromised passwords. But so we're looking for these different type of bot activities that happen. And so with Recaptcha version 3, what Recaptcha version 3 actually allows you to do is, let's take a look at the security settings real quick, lockout Recaptcha. So with Recaptcha version 3, if you set version 3 up, you can actually have it include script on all pages. And what this will do is allows Recaptcha to use its Recaptcha to use its different scoring technique to monitor this different activity and then decide whether or not it's a bot. So the more information that you're able to feed to it, the more likely it's going to be identify that it's a bot and then block them out. And so with brute force attacks, all this stuff and to kind of track for, all this stuff is going to be like right here in your security settings. So if you go to features, lockouts, all this stuff is going to be here. And once you have this set up, what's great is that the iThemes security dashboard allows you to look at this information. So instead of having to dig through your logs for all these different types of events, the security dashboard takes some of this stuff from, I had a better dashboard up, I'm not sure. Oh, here we go. So instead of you having to dig through your logs, the security dashboard gives you all the information that you kind of need. So you can see right here, this is actually the dashboard of iThemes.com. And we can see that March 2nd, we had 1,145 attacks, right? But that's great because it shows us the frequency. But what we can see is that by monitoring this stuff, we have since we enabled the dashboard, over 46,000 attacks have been prevented, as well as 11,000 IPs have been added to the ban list right here. And so this is the ban user security card on the security dashboard, which you can see all the different list of IPs that have been banned from your site. And again, these would not have made it here if we weren't monitoring for these attacks and logging them and logging the suspicious activity and getting them added over to here. So again, just wanted to show you how the security dashboard can give you a good summary of this kind of stuff, as well as show you your active lockouts. And then if you want to, you can release a lockout from here, which we're not going to do because this is obviously just a dumb person trying to use admin, not a high level thing, but they got locked out. So another thing is vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities are the #1 cause of most hacks. Vulnerabilities that have a patch applied is the #1 cause of most hacks. So the last vulnerability roundup had over 400 different plugins that were compromised in that vulnerability report. But with iThemes Security Pro, all you have to do is enable the site scan. And what that will do, it will check your site twice a day for if you have any known WordPress core plugin or theme vulnerabilities. And then using the version management integration, you can actually have it automatically update the fix if a vulnerability found. So what does all that mean? So on this site, I had where is it at? I had a site scan come with a critical issue of vulnerable software. And so I had Updraft, the free version of Updraft installed. I had a vulnerability. However, as that was disclosed, the patch came out pretty quickly after it was disclosed. And so find my automatic updates if it fixes the vulnerability. What that means, as soon as that update is available, it'll get updated on my site, protecting me from the vulnerability. again, I can't overemphasize how big of a problem vulnerabilities are on your website and why it's so important to keep track of them. And an example to illustrate this is the Equifax attack happened because there was a vulnerability on the with Apache, and Apache announced it. And I remember Chris Gene, who works in iThemes, sounding the alarms when he found out. He was immediately applying these the patch, because the thing is that Adobe disclosed the vulnerability, and then when they disclose the vulnerability, at the same time they release an update patching that vulnerability. And so you might be asking yourself, why would an attacker target a vulnerability for which there's already a patch? He knows that this hacker knew that in this case that Equifax and a lot of other people are lazy and they don't update their software. And so 6 months after that Apache vulnerability was disclosed and patched, Equifax was still they didn't update, and so they were able to exploit that vulnerability and hack them, and then leak millions of people's personal financial information. So that's why it's super important to make sure that you're keeping up to date with them. And vulnerability is going to happen. It's just developers are human, and unfortunately, sometimes they're going to make a mistake, or they're going to be using a third-party library that that has a vulnerability in it. For example, last week, a lot of people who were using Freemius, that they had a vulnerability, not necessarily in their own code, but in their implementation of freemium, and that's why the vulnerability report was so big, is because it was a shared library of sorts. And then so they didn't introduce the vulnerability into their own software. Another library introduced that vulnerability. So it's very important to make sure that you're staying up to date, and that's why having something like iThemes Security Pro automatically checking all your plugins and themes to make sure that they don't have any known disclosed vulnerabilities, so you can go and get them patched or remove them or whatever actions you need to take. And then file change is the last thing second last thing we're talking about, monitoring. And the reason why you want to file or monitor your different file changes is that when it comes down to a malware, it's one of three things: either files are added, files are removed, or in the case of the SolarWinds attack, where they initially modified that legitimate .dll file and they hid their malicious code in there, but they're able to add their own stuff, remove things that helped, remove things that would help detect it. So they were removing different security protocols and they were modifying files. So if you're using file change detection in iThemes Security Pro, which is in the site check, what you can do is you can monitor unexpected changes. Now, a change of a file isn't an automatic indicator that your site has been compromised. It just means the file has been changed, and it might be worth doing more investigation on it. However, if you do use the compare files online, this can help quiet some of the noise generated by file change detection by comparing the hashes to iThemes products. So anything that is an iThemes product, it can compare the hash files from an update to that. If the hash files match, it's a pretty good indication that the change wasn't malicious. And it's also going to look at WordPress core files and plugins that are in the WordPress.org repo. And so that can help add a little bit more sophistication to it. And again, it's not going to be an indication of a compromise, but again, it's just adding a layer and as something else to have as a, even if it doesn't immediately alert you to a breach, having that history of changed files can maybe help after you detect a breach to see what damage was done, and even possibly giving you an idea of point of entry. And another thing, last thing that we're going to talk about is user activity, is logging different user activity, like when they log in, log out. So for example, if you notice a strange login time from a strange IP address, this could be an indication of an attack was a user created or a new user registered, a new admin user registered that you didn't expect. There's been like privilege escalation vulnerabilities where if they change the default new user registration from subscriber to admin, and that can give you an indication of all of a sudden all these new admin users are being created of that kind of exploit. As we talked about, adding and removing plugins, switching themes, changing posts and pages. So just to give you an example of what that kind of looks like in the logs is you can see here on the training.ithemes.com, oh my goodness, look at all these different plugins that were being deleted and added by me and Nathan. We can see that, hey, those are two real people and they were doing that. I know what that is. Nathan knows that is not a cause for concern. But if there was something here that could, again, adding layers, adding multiple different, giving you as big of a data set as you possibly can to understand the health of your site. And I'm about done talking. Here's the resource page. Here is the disaster week deals again. Again, you can say 40% off the plugin suite, 35% of our Security Pro, Backup Buddy, Sync, Stash prices. So I talked a lot and I'm done talking. I'm ready to hear your questions and try to clarify anything you guys need.
All right. Sorry about that. I was struggling with the mute button. Thanks, Michael. Great stuff. Yeah, a lot of great questions in the chat room over the last hour. So if you have a question you haven't asked yet, use the chat room at ithemes.com/chat, and we'll get those over to Michael. All right. So, Michael, we had a holdover question from yesterday from Sal, and he asked, for WordPress, besides implementing iThemes Security Pro, is there anything he needs to manually do to better secure WordPress?
What you can do is Cloudflare has a free web application firewall plan that you can go sign up for. And for most people, it will work. And that will give you some extra protection of like against DDoS attacks, and then that'll help protect your site even more, even with the application level of security that you receive from iThemes Security Pro.
Very good. Let's see. Sue has Sue's question. Do you keep, when you're talking about logging, do you keep logs, just the database logs, or should we be saving logs that are in files too?
So you do have the database and the file logs. Typically, I don't mess with the file logs at all, however you can. The file logs are going to be incomplete compared to the database logs. And so I recommend doing database logs. However, if you do want to clear out those logs, you can create a database export of your log file to save those more for longer. But really, it shouldn't cut too much database load by having the log there. And there's nothing wrong with just increasing the time of how long you set to keep your logs. For example, again, I showed that, but we'll go and take a look at it again. But if you go to your configure, global settings, and then just do logging, you'll see that days to keep database logs. You can extend that out, and the longer that you feel comfortable extending it out, the better, because the longer of the history of security events that you keep, if you ever do detect a breach, the more likely you're going to be able to recover from that breach and actually find the point of entry. And so the reason why, even though it was over a year before that SolarWinds attack was initially flagged, the reason why they were able to do so much forensics investigation on it is because they actually had that history of that history of security activity that they monitored to trace back and then actually find out when this stuff really started happening to be able to properly assess the damage that was done. So the longer the better.
All right. Let's see. Sal has some great questions here. One of the questions he asked is, what do you do when you get brute force attacks? My client site is getting lots of brute force attacks.
So one, if you, a good thing to do would be sign up for that Cloudflare, because that can help mitigate some of the traffic. But truthfully, if you're seeing information, if you're getting alerted to, because sometimes iThemes Security Pro isn't very humble, it likes to tell you that it is doing its job. but there's nothing for you to do. You installed iThemes Security Pro to automate your security for you. And so if you are getting hit a bunch, guess what? iThemes Security Pro is telling you that it's locking them all out. There's no action for you to take other than, I don't know, go have a beer knowing that your site's protected and you can sleep easy because iThemes Security is, shutting that stuff down.
Very good. Let's see. Here's a good question from Robin. We get this one from time to time. Does using a plugin to change the WordPress login address, changing it to something other than WP admin, does that help at all?
So we do have it in the plugin, but we don't necessarily recommend doing it just because it doesn't. It can have a minimal impact, but it's more important to rely on things like refusing compromised passwords and then using two-factor authentication. So, especially with your admin users, if you have your refuse compromised passwords, this checks with the taps into the Have I Been Pwned API, see if that password that they're using has been used in a database breach in their database. It won't let them use it. And then two-factor authentication, according to Google, will protect against 100% of automated bot attacks. While you can change your WP admin URL, that can have a minimal impact and really should just, I would recommend doing that only for branding thing, but then you're making it more difficult. One of the great things about WordPress and the reason why it has 40% penetration, it behaves the same on every single site. So just like having the front door in the same place on everybody's house is good because then you know where to find it. So it's not that big of a deal, but having a lock on your door is great. And so having two-factor authentication, which is, if people would just use two-factor authentication, ransomware would be cut by 90%. I'm willing to bet at least 90% of ransomware attacks would be stopped by if people just use two-factor authentication. So anyways, that was just a great question and you gave me an opportunity to say how great two-factor authentication is. So I appreciate it. So
yeah, for sure. And it's a challenge. Danelle is just mentioning in the chat room that it's so hard. Even people who ought to know better, convincing them to use two-factor authentication is a challenge.
Yeah, we're hardwired to take the path of least resistance. And my wife, married to me, and she still doesn't like using two-factor authentication. My brother, when I told him I used two-factor authentication on every account, he laughed at me. So I understand the struggle.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just as a general thing, I'm not sure I would want to get into an argument with my spouse over two-factor, but that's.
Oh,
that's a whole other webinar.
Yeah, that's a whole other webinar.
But we should have a round table.
Important.
Yeah.
And we're going to start seeing I believe we're going to start seeing it's going to be mandated a lot more places. I already talked with some of the bigger tech companies when Joe Biden called them all to the White House for that cybersecurity conference. And because we've had these high profile attacks, and that pipeline attack could have been prevented if one, it sounds like they had someone there that they blamed on an intern using a weak password that was something like company name 1234. But even if they were using company name 1234, had they been requiring people to use two-factor authentication, that pipeline attack wouldn't happen. It wouldn't have been successful. So it is a minor inconvenience, but compared to the amount of negative publicity that company got, I think that now they're like, okay, we'll go ahead and require two-factor everywhere. And we're going to start seeing on the consumer side a lot more as well.
Yeah. So let me jump in here, Michael. We got a ton of questions stacked up in just about 10 minutes to try to get all these in here. So let's go to lightning round, quick questions, quick answers. While on the subject of two-factor, Sal says he uses a third-party plugin for two-factor and iThemes security. Is that okay? Or should only one plugin? What would you recommend?
I'm not sure what he means by that, because I use iThemes Security Pro, but I'm also using Authy for my two-factor authentication.
I think he has a separate plugin that enables two-factor other than iThemes security.
Enable similar features in multiple plugins, because that's always going to be a result of that's just going to result in conflict 9 out of 10 times.
Right. Let's see. Heather has a great question here. What are the main differences? Is there a way to summarize this, or is there a page maybe to point her to? The main differences between iThemes Security, the free version, and iThemes Security Pro.
iThemes Security, iThemes.com/security/WiGo I think is the we'll just do this and see if it'll do a search for me.
Kristen just put it in the chat room. iThemes.com/security/y-go-pro. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So perfect.
There you go, Heather. So there's a page that explains all of that. Let's see. Several questions about log files. Paul's first question was just looking at when you showed iThemes Security's dashboard. He's how big are those log files in your database? Should you clear that out? What about the size of your htaccess file? Would that slow down a site with that many lockouts?
So it really depends on your site. It shouldn't. If you are running a site and is making money, spend the money to have the resources available to manage log events. And so with how I think security works, there's two different way that this stuff is logged. One is in the security logs, and one and on the security dashboard is dashboard events. And so it will have a slimmed down kind of version of it, and it shouldn't cause too much flow. And it depends on how much history you have. As far as the htaccess goes, there is if that can end up becoming an issue, if it is an issue of when your site's loading and the htaccess is having problems, like once it's updated, timing out your site because it's writing all those things out, you can actually remove some of these and then remove the old ones, because most likely they've moved on. They're using different IPs after they've given an IP a bad name. So removing the old ones, you're probably going to be safe.
All right.
If that makes sense. I hope I answered that clearly.
Yep. Debbie has a question about log files. How long should you save the log files in iThemes Security? It defaults to 30 days, right?
I think it defaults to 60.
60 days.
It defaults to 60. However, if you can increase that timeline, the longer you increase that timeline, the better. Got
it. Doug is asking, where are iThemes Security Pro logs stored in my file system on the server?
If you save it as a file and not just as database, it's going to be in the WP content /plugins /iThemes Security Pro /uploads /logs.
Yep. So buried in the iThemes Security folder. Let's see. A couple of questions about file changes. Both Sal and John had questions regarding those file change warnings. He says Sal says, I get file change warnings, but I'm not sure how to verify. Seems like a lot of work to do manually. Any tips? John follows up on that saying he gets a lot of file change warnings from a caching plugin. Is there a short answer to help people better deal with the file change warnings?
Okay, so the last thing you want to do is have anything become a boy who cried wolf situation. So while even though a caching file can be exploited just like any other file, backup and caching files are examples of files that are going to generate a lot of expected changes and can generate a lot of noise. So if you go to your, we'll just look up file change, and then we'll go here, and then so you can exclude your caching files over here, so you won't be alerted to change files, and that will quiet some of the noise down. And again, to answer Paul's question, is that not everything's going to be worth investigating. So if you know that something was, so for example, if you have another way to quiet some of the noise, as I mentioned earlier, the online file check, if you have the version management enabled to do the updates, these will be known to be updated files and you won't be alerted to them. But also if it's a bunch of WordPress core files and you know that WordPress just updated, you know that that was due to the WordPress update. So you can do some deduction that way. And then not every single file change would be worthy of investigating. However, if you do notice a breach farther down the line, those file change will be in the logs, and that can help you then after a breach happens to assess what damage has been done. So it's not always about, it can help alert you to a breach, but if it doesn't, it can be there as a resource later to help you come back from it. I hope that helps.
All right. Joe has a question about the number of emails iThemes Security can send when a site is under attack. He said he had a client whose Office 365 flagged the site as a spam sender. What would you recommend in that situation?
So what I would recommend is if you look at your notification center, and then I would enable your security digest, and that will give you a summary of everything. And then you can disable these individual site lockouts, and that will drastically reduce the amount of emails that you receive from iThemes Security Pro. And so this won't have you lose anything. You won't not get these notifications. They'll just be here in the security digest because, as I mentioned earlier, there's nothing for you to do. There's no action for you to take if you get this site lockout notification. It's done. It's been taken care of. You can go instead of worrying about these individual site lockouts. You can go focus on doing revenue generating activities instead of worrying about managing this. So I always recommend that people disable this individual site lockout and enable the security digest.
Yep, there you go. Okay, 4 more quick questions and we'll take a break. Stacy asks, she has a VPS, and every site's in its own cPanel, which is best practice like we talked about yesterday. She says she gets the same IP address trying to log into all the websites on her VPS. It happens several times a week. How do they find every one of these websites?
Is it the host IP?
It's
an IP of
a bad actor, it sounds like. Yeah, exactly.
So there's many cases why, like, it could be a legitimate IP. So if you, for example, you're using like Backup Buddy with AWS.
Well, she's saying it's an IP address from other countries.
From other countries, if you're one, I can answer this one.
Oh, here's Timothy. Yeah, Timothy Jacobs is here, folks. He'll be presenting in the next hour. Go ahead, Timothy.
So you can basically, when you have a site's URL, you can find out the IP address that site is actually on, the host IP address that Michael was talking about. And then there are a lot of services that will tell you all the domain names that have that same IP address for their DNS records. So they look up one site, they say, okay, it's hosted this IP address. They look up that IP address, and they'll say a list of the 30, 40, 50 different sites that you have hosted on that IP address. So it's as simple as that. It is one of the reasons why it's important to put things like in different cPanel instances and things like that, though they will still probably have the same IP address unless you're buying a dedicated IP address for each of them. But as long as your sites are individually secure, you're not running into an issue when they're able to discover that you have more sites on the internet. If one of your sites does have a security vulnerability and you have that same mistake in every single one of your sites, then it could be an entry point for them to go from attacking one site to attacking 25 sites. But as long as your sites are secure, it shouldn't be an issue.
Very good. Let's see. Next question from Ben B. Is using the refused compromised password setting a necessity for members of a membership site, even though they have little access as a user?
That's going to be up to you. However, I would recommend doing it because you could also be doing them a favor by alerting them to the fact that they are using a compromised password. As you are likely seeing, there's more people already taking advantage of this. For example, Apple, if you are trying to use a password that they flag as compromised, they'll tell you, Chrome will tell you. So it's just becoming kind of a standard nice thing that you could do for your clients. Because if they're likely using that password elsewhere, and you might save them from some future headaches down the road.
Yep, for sure.
And beyond just a nice thing, if one of the users of your site's accounts gets hacked on your site, they're probably going to blame you. They're not going to blame themselves and the fact that they reused a password.
That's also, yeah.
It's always
forcing them to use a non-compromised password. It kind of protects you in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. My dad was really, really mad at Salesforce because his account got compromised, and it was the same password he used everywhere. And then once I figured out that, I kind of told him, but yeah, he wasn't going to blame himself. That's a great point, Timothy.
Okay, 2 more quick questions. Chris is asking, how does two-factor work when you're accessing your dashboard with iThemes Sync?
So there is actually a Timothy helped actually kind of configure this when iThemes Security is set up and you're logging into a site from sync with iThemes Security Pro.
Yeah, so we have a special setup flow that happens if you're running a site with iThemes Security when you have when you're trying to set it up with iThemes Sync. That'll essentially take you to the login page and we'll walk you through the login process, and you'll authenticate with two-factor, and then we'll send you back to iThemes Sync. So you shouldn't have any issues setting it up as long as you're using a recent, and by recent I mean past 2 years maybe, version of iThemes Security. You shouldn't have any issues setting up iThemes Security through iThemes Sync.
Yeah, awesome. All right, final question. Interesting one from Melanie. How does iThemes Security work on hosts that don't use htaccess files? She says, I'm thinking of clients who are on WP Engine who has decided to deprecate the htaccess file for all customers.
They'll use PHP to block the IPs. We have an article about it in the Help Center that I'm trying to pull up real quick that explains how that works.
All right. So we'll drop that in the chat, Melanie. That's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that before. But it's time for a break. So we have Timothy Jacobs coming up in the next hour for an advanced security talk using iThemes Security. The first talk like this we've ever done of getting some of the filters and hooks and actions and some fun things on the back end. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 10 minutes after 2 Central Time. So 10 minutes after the hour, and we're quiet until then.